Welcome to Wednesdays with Willa. I am your host, Willa White, and this is my weekly podcast show that airs on Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern on my Facebook page, Willa White Medium. It's also available on Blog Talk Radio for those who want the listen-only feature. So you go to Blog Talk Radio, and there's a whole host of shows that happen throughout the week. This is year 6 of Wednesdays with Willa, so I've had a lot of great guests on the show, a lot of wonderful topics, and I encourage you to look back at the archive videos of the show so you can learn more about spiritualism, mediumship, healing, faith, family, or more. And today I am delighted to have as my special guest, Dr. Eben Alexander. Thanks for being here today.
Well, Willa, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Beautiful. I know a lot of people are very excited. You're coming to Lilydale again this summer, and there's a whole weekend that is dedicated to something you know very well, near-death experiences. And for those of you who don't know who Dr. Eben Alexander is, he's a neurosurgeon and also a best-selling author. He's written books like Proof of Heaven, Map of Heaven, and also Living in a Mindful Universe. And he's bringing a whole host of experience, not just on that from the scientific realm, but also from the spiritual realm. And he's able to merge those two things and make sense for both sides of the fence of the people that come from those modalities. And I know we're very excited that you're going to be here. Please mark your calendars and plan to be here in Lilydale, July 14th, 15th, and 16th. I do have posted on this that's going out on Facebook. You will be able to get the tickets to Dr. Eben Alexander's workshops that he's doing. I think it ends up being like four of them that you're doing while you're here. And so people have wonderful opportunities to learn from you and also from Karen, who will have on the show another day to talk about sacred acoustics. But let's dive into your journey, because I know some people might not be familiar with your work and also your experience, despite the fact that you've been on hosts of TV shows out there, and your book has definitely made an impact in the world. But let's start them with a little background about you today.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to point out that I grew up in a very scientific family. And I was adopted. I was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old and adopted at age 4 months. And that does figure into my story very prominently. People who have read Proof of Heaven will realize. But the reality is I had a very scientific upbringing. My father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, and he knew all about physics, cosmology, all the big neuroscientific concepts, everything he was very familiar with, but he also had a very strong belief in a loving personal God. He had grown up with his father, who was a general surgeon in Eastern Tennessee, taking him to a Presbyterian church every Sunday of his life. And when my dad went off to war in World War II as a combat surgeon in the Pacific Theater, he had a little pocket Bible. I still have it. It's by my bedside. I use it when I meditate. But this little pocket Bible, I think his faith is what really got him through World War II relatively unscathed. He spent more than 2 years overseas and then came back to this world. That was my upbringing, was with this very scientific father, but one who also had a deep, rich spirituality to him, because he wasn't just religious. He deeply knew and sensed this presence of God and the power of prayer, and he used it in his work. Now, like many who grew up in the 1960s and 70s, like I did, I always knew science was the pathway to truth. But like so many others, I made the big mistake of thinking that the modern conventional version of science, as it's presented to the masses, which is a form of Newtonian determinism, that leads you into basically away from the truth. And because, the main postulate of that materialist or physicalist thinking is that only the physical world exists, and therefore you must somehow come up with a way that the physical material of the brain can muster conscious phenomenal experience. And that is a big challenge. In fact, it's an impossible challenge, as was pointed out by David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher in the mid-90s. in his book, The Conscious Mind, where he defined the hard problem of consciousness. And it's not only a hard problem, it actually is impossible from a materialist standpoint. And that's why materialists or physicalist scientists deny all of these stories like near-death experiences, shared death experiences, past life memories in children, suggestive reincarnation. They say it's all nonsense, because if the brain is creating consciousness, when the brain ends, that's the end of conscious awareness. But they're wrong. There's evidence by way of millions of cases of people who actually demonstrate that when you die, you have an expansion of conscious awareness. And that's really where this gets fascinating. And so what I've come to realize, and what my near-death experience proved to me, because I had this severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis back in November 2008. And there's been a medical case report written on my case because it is so extraordinary. It's unprecedented in medical literature. And that's one of the problems for the lay public and the lay press, is they don't know how to interpret the depth of the medical details in my case, which make it crystal clear. The case report, written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, they make 2 major points. One is that my brain could not have had any dream or hallucination. It was far too damaged, and it was all of my neocortex. There was no region left unscathed. That much was evident from the CT and MRI scans. But more importantly were the neurologic exams. Glasgow Coma Scale, which in you or me would be 15. In a corpse, it'd be 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And most of my week in coma, my Glasgow Coma Scale was 6 to 7, probably at sometimes as low as 5. And especially given the nature of the damage to the neocortex and what was evident on the scans and lab values, it was crystal clear that my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination. So how did I have the most extraordinary set of visions, detailed, memorable, and life-transforming, all at a time when my brain was demonstrably offline? And that was the question I was forced to answer when I came back to this world, to make sense of it. Now, the second major point of that case report is when they submitted it, the peer review editors at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases said, well, wait a minute, this is unprecedented. This case is absurd. You don't have people this sick from E. coli meningoencephalitis who then end up making a full recovery after a week in deep coma. How do you explain it? And the doctors who wrote the case report said it's because he had the near-death experience. That's what allowed for a miraculous recovery. And the scientific reviewers said, okay, good, case explained, we'll publish it. And that was that. And it's because they knew of other cases like Anita Morjani, who's stage 4 lymphoma, very advanced, disappeared when she had a profound near-death experience. Or Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who wrote the book To Heaven and Back, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning in a kayaking accident in Chile back in the late 1990s. Ask any physician, somebody who spends more than 30 minutes drowning in warm water, what are their prospects for survival? They'll tell you they don't. More than 4 or 5 minutes underwater, no oxygen in warm water is deadly, and it starts to basically kill off the brain. And yet when they brought Mary to the surface dead and resuscitated her, she ended up having a very prolonged recovery. But because of her rich spiritual experience, she ended up having a full recovery, just like I did. And this is where I think we need to pay attention. People who have these profound spiritual experiences end up having recoveries that are inexplicable by modern medical thinking. And that is very important because it teaches us something about health, healing, becoming whole, and that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And the more we appreciate that, understand that, and use our personal efforts to expand our relationship with that kind of higher soul and primordial mind, that intelligence of the universe, that infinitely loving God force at the core of all reality that near-death experiencers have witnessed going back thousands of years. And that is what is so amazing about all of this, are the healing prospects coming into a deeper understanding of our journeys here. And especially when you recognize that the scientific evidence for reincarnation is really overwhelming. Any scientist who says, no, there's no such thing as reincarnation simply has not read any of the data. They're willfully ignorant, and that's their right. But, the rest of us should not be paying too much attention to what they say, because they're not going to be leading us anywhere closer to truth. And in fact, it's one of the biggest and most damaging aspects of our scientism, which is basically the worship of science as the only source of truth. And I would remind people that Richard Feynman, a renowned quantum physicist who won a Nobel Prize for his work in the mid-20th century on quantum physics, said in his Nobel Prize speech that there is a tremendous amount of truth that will be uncovered, but it will not be through the scientific method. In other words, he recognized the limitations of the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is very important and helps us tremendously, but it is not a demand that any knowledge must be proven by a randomized, double-blinded, controlled experiment. There's a tremendous amount of truth that we can discern through human experience. And especially when it comes to consciousness and these deep questions of the brain-mind connection, and especially about things that involve conscious awareness after bodily death, we really have to pay attention to the details and try and understand it all. But to simply sweep it under the rug, deny it, debunk it, say it's not real because it doesn't fit our theoretical models, is clearly very anti-scientific thinking. And that's where some of my critics have fallen very, very short in kind of accusing me of, fabricating this, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not obviously going to answer the question of how do you explain, if you go through those medical records in that medical case report, how in the world do you explain this complete recovery? And that's where, of course, the mystery deepens. That's where I was driven 15 years ago now into diving much deeper into coming to an understanding of the nature of reality, the mind-brain relationship, and fundamentally, what is consciousness? And that's where we go in our books, Proof of Heaven, which to me is more of a question mark. Map of Heaven is a statement about how common these experiences are, because thousands of people who read Proof of Heaven would reach out to me and share their story. And they often said, I've never told anybody this before, but. And then they would share a world-changing story. And so we put a lot of those into the Map of Heaven, but it's really the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. It came out in 2017, and that was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, who has been a tremendous resource to me in terms of spiritual guidance and wisdom. And we wrote that book together, and I think that makes it much more readable for the general reader, because Karen has a very kind of level-headed approach to explaining things. And sometimes I would tend to get a little too over the deep end in the scientific side, and she would help rein it in. And I would say that Proof of Heaven is mainly a question mark, saying, wow, these things are real, they happen, but how do we explain them? Living in a Mindful Universe is the book that really starts to unite science and spirituality and bring it all together, because that's where the answers will lie. And I think it's important to point out that there's now a 10th anniversary edition of the book Proof of Heaven, which has 36 additional pages in it. And those pages go a long way to explaining a tremendous amount about the consolidation of science and spirituality that is occurring. And a lot of that is a result of Proof of Heaven and my story, but it's really a consolidation of millions of cases and thousands of reports that help us to get to a deeper truth about all this. So that's basically who I was before, and had this catalytic experience that proved to me that our current scientism, which is very much in fashion, is wrong. And it's basically Newtonian determinism, because people have not yet figured out what quantum physics is trying to tell us after more than a century of investigation. But I will say that awarding the Nobel Prize for entanglement in 2022, that's this very mysterious feature of quantum physics that's been proven through experiments over the last 4 or 5 decades. And it shows that we're connected through a mental layer of the universe, and that it completely transcends space and time. And that is where the wisdom lies. And that, of course, is where mediumship, after-death communications, all of this occurs through that mental layer, which involves, phenomenal experience and mentation from those alive as well as those who have left the physical plane. It's been open field running here, but living in a mindful universe is definitely the ticket forward in terms of explaining a lot of how this is scientific and leads us into a whole new science, the quantum-informed science of consciousness, that will help us rise above that false sense of separation of materialism that's been so damaging to our world.
Mm-hmm. It's a return to the understanding of the sacred and recognizing that you are a living miracle because of your experience, and that you telling people about that experience helps them to bring that into themselves a little bit more, an understanding of the sacred connection that we can all have, that we can access these things without having to have a brush with death, shall we say.
Right.
But I think it'd be great for those that are tuning in today, if you could explain a little bit about what it felt like to be in that realm. So here you are in the coma, your brain is being eaten up by an infection, your family's worried around you, and you're conked out, not understanding what they're going through. You are in your own experience that you are having on a very spiritual level. And tell people a bit about that experience.
Well, it turns out it's important to point out that one of the crucial features of my NDE, which is atypical, you don't usually hear of this in near-death experiences, but that I had a complete deletion of memory when I went into it. And I think that was absolutely essential, because any kind of assumptions, religious predispositions, scientific knowledge that might have influenced my interpretation of things was all deleted on the way in. And that amnesia, I think, enabled me to have the kind of lessons that I ended up gaining, even though they were far more challenging and difficult to explain and understand. Ultimately, they came in more powerful and complete because of that amnesia, because of that complete deletion of any kind of presumptions going into it. And I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of Earth, this universe. And where it all began for me was a place that I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse kind of subterranean existence. I remember having all kinds of sensory input. I didn't have any body awareness at all, but it was like there were roots or blood vessels all around me. There was this kind of pounding sound in the background, these very kind of strange kind of smells. And it's just really weird the way that kind of thing can unfold. But that was just an initial phase. And I was rescued from that by this slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view and led me up like a light portal or a wormhole up into this rich, ultra-real gateway valley. And this is the realm where people have these experiences. It's where they reunite with their higher soul. It's where they reunite with the souls of departed loved ones. It's where you go through life review. Very important. People understand life reviews are described in 25 to 50% of near-death experiences. And as Bruce Grayson, who is the MD who's written on NDEs more than just about anybody over the last half century, reported in an article he wrote, a summarizing article about life reviews in the Journal of Near-Death Studies back in, I think it was September of 2021, he made it very clear that life reviews seem more real than lived reality. People think that, these will be vague and dreamy and murky. This world, this material world, is vague and dreamy and murky compared to that realm. That realm is crisp, sharp, alive, just dripping with meaning and relationships and understanding. It's incredibly difficult to explain. And just to kind of finish that off about Bruce Grayson, is not only are they more real than lived experiences, but also, importantly, they're more like a reliving than a remembering. And people often are shocked by the kind of detail of life reviews of certain elements and how they seem to be able to almost change these elements in their soul journey. And the third, and I think most important point that he made about life reviews, is that they are not from your personal perspective, but often seem to be from the perspective of those around you who were affected by your thoughts and actions. So in other words, if you spend a lot of your life handing out pain and suffering to other people, your life review is not going to be a lot of fun, because you have to be on the receiving end of all that. And feel what it was like to dish out what you were dishing out to people. So in many ways, the life review is kind of a moderator, or a way of kind of gently nudging us towards those principles of love and kindness, compassion. Because if nothing else, the life review is the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. And the fact that they are so common in NDEs is very remarkable. Now, I did not have an Eben Alexander life review because of the amnesia. It was simply impossible. But what I did witness was, as I ascended up through these spiritual levels, and this Gateway Valley was my next stopping point. But what I witnessed was seeing life reviews and reincarnation in this gigantic kind of panorama generic view that showed me all these interwoven threads of soul lines through multiple incarnations, all leading towards this brilliant transformation of all consciousness. So it was really a beautiful vision. But getting back to my story and that second phase, we've left the Earth Where My View, gone up into the Gateway Valley, way too real to be real. Just to point out, the very life review demonstrates this, because in a life review, people witness their birth, their death, everything in between, even extended into other lifetimes. That is a pretty kind of astonishing stuff to be witnessing. But it is all there for a purpose, to help us to slowly come into realizing we're basically sharing the dream of the one mind. And I would say this is one of the biggest points we make in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is making the scientific case for one mind, and that we're all sharing it. Now, we don't think that. We think our minds are separate and isolated from each other, but phenomena like telepathy can be readily demonstrated. For example, Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, he says that 35% of identical twins have very powerful telepathic experiences. So these are not uncommon. And of course, it's not limited to twins. You can have telepathy between all kinds of people. But it shows us that we're sharing that one mind. And I love to give us an example. In Anita Morjani's NDE, where she had stage 4 lymphoma, was very close to death, deep coma, should have died within hours. In her NDE, her mind melded beautifully with her brother, who was flying from India to China, to Hong Kong, supposedly for her funeral. And she melded minds with him. At the same time, she could meld minds with her father, who had already left the physical plane, with his spirit. It's all the same, because it's the mental universe. That's what we're accessing. And that's what we have access to as sentient beings, where the brain serves as a filter or transceiver to allow us to access that information. And that includes accessing memory. We talk in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, how memories are not stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. And yet neurosurgeons have wondered for a century or more why it is that, in spite of all the brain resections we've done, there's never been a reported case of a swathe of long-term memories being deleted with a resection of any part of the brain. And it's because memories are not stored in the brain at all. You can interfere with short-term to long-term memory conversion by damaging the hippocampus and medial temporal structures, but that has nothing to do with answering the question of where are memories stored. And all the evidence very strongly says they're not stored in the brain at all. So we need a much bigger kind of understanding of the brain-mind relationship and the nature of consciousness in the scientific world. And the good news is we're moving towards that. If you go to GalileoCommission.org, scientificandmedical.net, both of those sites I am a scientific advisor for, and you'll find the scientific models to explain all this are becoming very advanced. So we can finally leave the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends that death of the brain and body is the end of conscious awareness. We can leave that in the rearview mirror. because it's not true. And there's a much richer kind of interrelationship we share with all of our fellow beings and with the universe at large.
Yes, it's beautiful that you can put that so succinctly, that this dimensional understanding that people have can be blown out of the water, and that you had that experience yourself. Other people have had NDEs, and even if you haven't had an NDE, you can feel that, know that on a deep level. And as you're talking today, I know that there are people who will take this in and say, yes, that I know that to be the truth within my own self, because they've had personal experiences, but they also recognize truth when they hear it. So it's beautiful that you're working so steadily with other folks to help the masses understand this more, that they can bring the sacred connection into their everyday life. And I know in part of your experience, as much as being amnesiac, you were at your basic default setting, and it's like no other apps were running at the time, so you could focus and have this supercharged experience. And along the way, I know there was an important spirit that assisted you in your experience that you were having. And can you talk a little bit about her, please?
Yes, I can. And to do that, I need to return to where I was in my story, because I'd only kind of partially answered your question about, earthworm eye view leading up into other layers. And so I need to return back to where I went from that earthworm eye view into that Gateway Valley. Way more real than this world, as I said. Beautiful, verdant valley, kind of like Plato's world of ideals. There was no sign of any death or decay. It was beautiful beyond description, very dynamic. I remember blossoms, buds on flowers, trees, etc. Everything just is rich, opening, fertile, incredibly hard to describe because of its dynamic, pure being aliveness. But that's what I was witnessing there. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. At no point did I have any body awareness during the entire 7-day coma. But on this butterfly wing, I witnessed thousands of beings down in the meadow below. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools. And this butterfly was among a sea of butterflies, looping and spiraling in vast formations, just this dynamic ocean of color, evolving, opening, dynamic, leading forward, taking me into this rich experience in the valley. And I remember a soft summer breeze blowing through, and that was my first awareness of the divine, of the infinitely loving and healing power of that God force. And I will point out that Bruce Grayson, when he reviewed his 5-decade study of NDEs, he remarks that 90% of people who have these experiences come back believing in some form of a God force at the core of the universe that is of love and kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance. That is the ingredients that there. Religions have tried to describe it, but NDEs do a beautiful job of bringing it into focus and showing us that beautiful reality. Now, it turns out I was not witnessing all of this alone. There was a beautiful spiritual companion. That's who accompanied me on the butterfly wing. And she was there from the very get-go as I entered that Gateway Valley. And I'll never forget her face and just this look of pure love, this very comforting presence. She never said a word to me. She didn't have to. Her truth was delivered to me very powerfully through an emotional kind of mind meld. And the message that was delivered conceptually and emotionally at that time, that I then translated into words weeks later when I was writing this all up, those words of the message she gave me, I think were the central message I was to bring back to this world. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are greatly loved and cared for. And I cannot tell you how comforting that was at the time. And it just, I recognize, as much as this may sound like a foreign territory to some people, it absolutely is a spiritual home. And it is very comforting. There's absolutely nothing there to fear. And you start to sense this deep connection with that loving, creative God force. And in fact, that was my next level of my journey. That beautiful guardian angel, that message that was so comforting and reassuring, that brought me so much trust in the process. Well, what then happened was I realized that down below in the meadow, there were thousands of beings dancing, joy, merriment. When I came back weeks later, I called them souls between lives, because that's how I interpreted their presence. And all this dancing and merriment, there were children playing, there were dogs jumping. People often ask about their pets. And of course, animals are richly included in the spiritual realm. In fact, it's our kind of rational mind that takes us away from the spirituality that is native and organic and inherent in all sentient beings. And that's why this kind of awakening is so important, because it's returning us to those spiritual elements that are right at the heart of our very existence. But in my journey, what I witnessed in this ascendance was that these angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that were fueling all this incredible festivity going on in the Gateway Valley, they provided yet another musical portal. And that's what took me up into the next level of this journey. I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of what I call deep time or meta time, a very different ordering of causality that's much more fundamental in the evolution of souls and with the evolution of all consciousness. And I saw all of that collapsing down. And that became what I call the oversphere, this complex kind of universe through all eternity that was there to use it for teaching points. Because in that realm, often it's knowledge through identification. As we're shown things, as our higher soul kind of guides this journey, we become huge swathes of the scene. That's exactly what happens in those life reviews, where people report experiencing it from the emotional perspective of those around them who were affected by their thoughts and actions. That's showing us this kind of dreaming of the one mind that we're all experiencing, and how powerful that is as a teaching tool. But what I witnessed was all of that collapsing down as I entered what I call the core. The core was my ultimate destination in this journey. It was a complete resolution of all dualities, all paradoxes. And that's where I realized that our very conscious awareness is directly sourced in that infinitely loving God force, that it's right there. We're never separate from that. And that was, people often think, well, it's your religious beliefs that dictate what happens in an NDE. That's not true. The content of the NDE is very independent of that and can be very instructive. The way that we tell the story might reflect some of our religious prejudices. And I think that's why it's important that, as much as I'd grown up in a Christian, Methodist, then Episcopalian faith, in the year 2000, I went through a dark night of the soul. I explain all that in the book Proof of Heaven, where I had a perceived rejection from my birth mother. And, even though I found out my birth parents had gotten married and had 3 children, that was a giant shock. But in the same 2-minute phone call, found out that it was not a good time to come back in their lives. And that rejection was a big, bad deal. If you read the adoption literature, you'll realize if an adult adoptee gets another rejection from their birth family, in addition to when they were rejected at the time of being put up for adoption, it can really tip them over. And it did. In the year 2000, that 2-minute message from the social worker that it was not a good time to come back in their lives basically tipped me over, sent me into a dark night of the soul that lasted for 8 years, right up until my coma. But it was important to set the stage, to have that doubt, because I think that's where my NDE had such a powerful effect, was my doubting the reality of that God that I had wanted to believe in all those years. And now, wham, boy, did I get solid evidence of the reality of that God force, and that it was right there at the source of my conscious awareness. And that is, I think, a beautiful lesson for all of us to realize how tight that connection is. Now, it turns out many things were taught at all levels of this journey, and I would also cycle through them. Spontaneously, I would just tumble back down to that earth for my view. And then every time I came back through that beautiful spiritual guide, the girl on the butterfly wing, giving me that beautiful message of reassurance and of love, and that I could trust in the universe. And so The way it all evolved, just to kind of get to the end of this part of the story, was every time I entered the Corps, I was told, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. But we'll have many things to teach you. And that was really kind of how it evolved. And I came to believe that going back was just going back to that earthworm eye view, which wasn't a huge problem, was by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could conjure up that light portal that would take me back up into the Gateway Valley. But they weren't kidding in the Corps when they told me I wasn't there to stay. And there came a time after multiple passages through these levels that I tried conjuring up that musical melody from the earthworm eye view, and it didn't work. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew by then I could trust in the universe. And that's when I witnessed thousands of beings going off into the distance around me, murmuring, some holding candles. This murmuring energy was elevating me, just like I'd been elevated early on in the Gateway Valley and the Core realm by this beautiful sense of that loving God force. Now I was feeling it down in this lowest realm, and it was coming from all these beings around me. What I called that when I came back weeks later in writing it all up was the power of prayer. And that's what I was sensing. And it was guiding me back towards this world. And then the last thing that I witnessed in the NDE, very important, 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and then disappear again. I didn't understand the words because my amnesia still included amnesia for the English language, but I could sense this kind of emotional feel and connection with them. And they were all very important because in the hours that I then woke up, even though my brain was still addled, in the hours where I was first coming out of coma, I could remember those faces, and now I could identify them. And I said, well, you were there and you were there, because they were people who were in the ICU bed the last 24 hours of coma. Very important, because that helped me to realize the vast majority of the coma experience happened between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5. I go into all that timing data in Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. But those were the last things I saw. And very importantly, I think one of them, important to point out, was Susan Renchitz. She was a family friend. I'd first met her in freshman English at UNC Chapel Hill in 1972. Then we kind of lost touch. Then she became very close friends with my former spouse when they were teaching together in Raleigh. And in fact, Susan had done work with channeling. And she had written a book called Third Eye Open, and about how she had helped people, including helping people in coma. And because of that, my family contacted her when I was deep in coma and asked Susan to intervene from her home in Chapel Hill, which was, 120, 130 or so miles away. And one of the 6 faces I witnessed was Susan. She was there clear as a bell, just like the others who were physically present in the ICU room. So when I woke up and I said, Susan was here, they said, well, she wasn't physically here, but she channeled to you nights 4 and 5. And I went, fine. It made perfect sense to me. I knew where I'd been was non-local. And the fact that she could connect with me very directly from, going into a meditative trance and channeling made perfect sense. So obviously I had already grown up a lot as a scientist in admitting the reality of that phenomena. But the last face I saw was the one that made the biggest difference. It was a 10-year-old boy. It turned out it was my son Bond. I didn't recognize him when I saw him in that vision in the NDE. He was the last face I saw, and it turned out that was Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. I'd started the week with the doctors estimating 10% chance of survival. Now on day 7, down to 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And it turns out Bond overheard that conference where they were recommending stopping the ventilator, stopping the antibiotics, and letting me die. And that's when Bond realized, oh my God, and he came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking over there, one over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're gonna be okay. Daddy, you're gonna be okay. As if somehow that would make it so. And it turns out, even though I didn't understand the words and I didn't recognize them, but I sensed this deep spiritual connection between 2 souls. And that's when I realized, for the first time, because the whole journey deep in coma, I thought this can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. And now all of a sudden it did matter, because there was another soul out there that was very near and dear to me, even though I didn't remember our relationship. And that's what compelled me to come back to this world, was a sense of responsibility to this other soul. And getting back to your original question about that beautiful guardian angel that I saw in the butterfly wing multiple times, who was such a source of comfort, those who've read the book Proof of Heaven know the answer to that. And it has to do, I'm not going to give a spoiler alert here. I'm not going to spill all of it, but I will tell you that 4 months after my coma, I received a picture in the mail from my birth family, and I recognized that beautiful guardian angel as my birth sister. There's so much more to that story, so I haven't really spoiled it for people, but oh my God, that was a giant wake-up call. It's almost as if she was looking at me as if to say, do you finally get it? So yes, I was finally getting it, the deep nature of our spiritual connection. And there's a reason why she was my spiritual guide and not my adoptive father. You know, he had passed over 4 years before my coma. He's the one I would have scripted into that role if I'd been, constructing this NDE, but he was nowhere to be found. And as I explained in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, when I did encounter him in deep meditation 2 years later, I learned why. And it was because he knew that in spite of the 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis in an adult and a 1 in a billion recovery, if my guardian angel had been my father, as I wanted to script it, I would have tended to dismiss the whole thing as, I guess, the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. You see who you want to see. And that's why the universe had to up the ante and give me a spiritual guide, very important, who was someone I had never met in my lifetime. What was absolutely crucial in my life as being a younger sister in my birth family who I never met.
Yes, and that's the proof in the pudding, having that kind of personal experience. There's nothing in your life that will ever trump personal experience. People can tell you a story, but you have to live that story. And to have this spirit communication, in essence, which here you are dead, but your spirit, you're having a mediumship experience at the same time, and then have that validated. It's the things that don't make sense at the time that you find out later have the most synchronicity involved, and that you can see that there's a greater force that's orchestrated that communication, that meeting, and that meet cute, right? That
Right.
people have in their lives with certain folks. And what powerful recognition you had on a soul level that she was that important to you. And
Well,
so
that was a deep mystery to me, because I felt such a deep connection with her. And then when I started reading the NDE literature, which I'd never paid attention to before, I realized how that spiritual guide is somebody who was very important to you in your lifetime, and yet I didn't know who she was. So that was a profound kind of shocker that kind of illuminated to me this beautiful kind of connectedness of spirituality and of our spiritual essence, our soul connection with others.
yes, and it's inexplicable in some ways. Now, I would ask, have you had any spiritual experiences since your NDE that you would call a mediumship experience, something where maybe you've connected with her again, or others in spirit that you have felt with you?
Well, I've actually had quite a bit of experience along those lines, and specifically to me, one of the most important, which I briefly mentioned a minute ago, was the encounter with my adoptive father's soul, which happened a little over 2 years post-coma. And again, I do report all of that in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, because it was so profound for me. But I think the important thing to point out is that I didn't go in asking to see him. This was in a meditation, and this reveals the power of meditation, of going within, which all of us should be doing if we have an interest in coming to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our relationship with the universe at large, and especially our power to influence emerging reality. Meditation, centering, prayer, these are absolutely crucial. But to me, this beautiful experience, and it really, the way I do meditation, and I use sacred acoustics, and that's something we can talk about. And I know you're going to be interviewing Karen. She's the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, but it's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And as a neuroscientist, I was fascinated by that technique because I realized how theoretically it could have great power, because you're using these differential frequency sounds to influence the lower brainstem. and causes slow oscillation in the lower brainstem. And that is what is so powerful. You're going at a circuit that arose more than 300 million years ago in evolutionary biology. And that's why I believe separating, our conscious awareness from here, now, and a sense of self, which is basically what meditation allows us to do, is very, very profound using these kind of tones. And that's what I discovered, way back 2 years post-coma or whatever, but it was instrumental in my encounter with my father. And in that particular meditation, what I always do is I let Eben Alexander linguistic brain make a request or statement, your ego mind. And this is where I point out, don't think that you are the thoughts in your head, that's your identity. That's your little ego mind. It can be very intoxicated. It can be very misleading. And there's an aspect of you that you can develop in meditation that is kind of higher soul, connected to that primordial mind, that is far wiser. And that's one of the biggest reasons to use meditation, to help us really to grow and to come into complete wholeness and healing. But I remember stating the request at the beginning of that meditation, am I on the right path? And that was just a question about the meditation, about differential frequency brainwave entrainment, about those specific technical features of my meditative practice at the time. And in that setting of just, am I on the right path? That's where I encountered my father. I wasn't intending to encounter him at all. And yet what happened was I went to deep territory. And again, this is all explained in Living Mindful Universe, but in my mind, this very deep territory I was used to because I was in a program at that time at the Monroe Institute to help rescue souls who might be kind of stuck, materialist minds who didn't realize they had died and their spirit was kind of wandering. But we had missions to go in and help those people. I was doing that kind of thing. And going deep into meditation with, am I on the right path, is the intention. I floated up over the bridge and then had this incredible vision of two young men in a cafe that was hewn into the rocky walls of this gorge as they sank down. But anyway, the interesting thing is it was my father and his college roommate. They were there in their early 20s. He had passed over at age 91. And yet here he was, the absolute picture of perfect health. And he turned and looked at me, gave me a wink and a smile. And with that one wink and smile, and then he turned back talking to his friend, an incredible thought ball of information that completely answered the question of, that's the way information is often passed in that realm. It's not a linear narrative and like a paragraph here and a paragraph there, but wham, a complete set of information about my being on an absolutely correct path, about consciousness being fundamental in the universe, about using differential frequency brainwave entrainment to address consciousness, to penetrate the veil, come into the spiritual realm. Every bit of it was answered with that wink and the smile. But it was the presence of the college roommate, that jagged edge you mentioned a little bit ago, how important those little pieces that don't seem to fit can be. And that's where the golden nuggets lie, is in the little pieces that don't make sense, don't line up, are unexpected. It's one of the reasons why modern science, rejecting all these stories as made up nonsense, is cheating modern science from getting closer to the truth. So by bearing the evidence, don't expect to come closer to any kind of truth. But in my case, I talk about it in that book, but multi-week investigation, emails to the children of Robert Monroe, Agnew Bonson, et cetera. That was a college roommate. All of it added up to a tremendous amount of understanding about being on the right path, and a gigantic answer that I never could have gotten if I hadn't paid attention to those anomalies at the edge, like the presence of his college roommate and things like that.
Beautiful. And, that kind of phenomenal structuring that's going on to let you know that you're on the right path. There's that intuitive lead, there's that divine hunch, and then there's that download. And sometimes it's as fast as a quick text message, and sometimes it's this full body experience that is welling up in you, that's responsive to what is your truth and how that can lead you closer to the divine. And since your father's experience with your father, have you felt him since, or has that been something that has only been on the fringes of your awareness, or have you been able to develop any kind of sustained mediumship communication?
Well, I have, and the way I do that is through the meditation. I use sacred acoustics an hour or two a day. I've been doing that for more than 11 years now. It's been a very powerful part of my overall recovery and assimilation of what I went through in my near-death experience. I don't even pretend that I'm, towards the end of understanding it all. I feel like the journey is the destination, and it's really this pathway of discovery and unfolding that is so beautiful. And to me, that is it. That is what makes it all worthwhile, is being on that pathway of discovery. But yes, I've actually, in many of the questions that I ask in meditation, I would say that when I'm able to go really deep, which does take me often, an hour or two of really focused meditation, I have been able to utilize both my father, my birth sister, who was that first guardian angel, and basically my higher soul. There is wisdom that comes to us that seems to be just a knowing. And that, I think, it doesn't seem to be coming from one of these agents, guides, angels, things like that. And I think that is often higher soul knowledge that just comes from that primordial mind connection that is so deep and rich, that is showing us we're not separate from it. That's why it seems to be just kind of a gnosis that comes with the information. And it's kind of a sense of heart consciousness. It's something you feel. It's emotional, it's intuitive, it's kind of all of that wrapped up, but you know it. And to me, a lot of that has involved the spirit guides that I first encountered, in my NDE, and then encountered in meditation in those efforts early on. And I've had an evolution of that kind of relationship with them over time. And it really, in many ways, it seems to be kind of up to them, because I can go in with certain intentions, but it's very important not to, hold on too tightly. People want to have these profound experiences, but what I found is the more you grab for the profound experience, the more elusive it can be. And so it's really a process of letting go and embracing and trusting in the universe. Because if you try and force it, your little ego mind, your rational thinking mind, they're going to start interjecting all kinds of difficulties with it. Because what you're really trying to do in meditation, from my perspective, is to take that little ego of self, let it state a request, make an intention, what have you, but then it goes into timeout. And then I've learned to ride the tones, the sacred acoustics tones. And people who have listened to sacred acoustics, and you can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more, know what I'm talking about. But in that process of riding those tones, you go deeper and deeper, focusing on my breathing and the tones. My little linguistic voice just lets go. That little monkey mind that has, grocery lists and to-do lists, it disappears from the equation. And that's where I found the real power. But it's this art of letting go. It's something I expressed at the very opening to the book, Proof of Heaven, where I talked about how when I was a child, I used to have dreams of flying, and how I would be out in the yard and I'd start floating up, and the higher and faster I went, the better. But if I tried to embrace it too much, I'd crash right back into the ground. So it's letting go. It's inviting the universe to offer us things, but then letting go of the outcome and just witnessing what unfolds. And that is a real art. It's something that I learned over time, but it has been very powerful for me to allow the universe and my higher soul and that primordial mind to show me what I need to know in answer to the requests and kind of questions I have, the intentions I state in meditation. And of course, over time, as you meditate more and more like that, all of your waking moments become like a meditation, because you have developed such a rich kind of relationship across the veil with that spiritual realm that it's very natural in your kind of waking, walking state to still be that connected. And that, to me, is one of the beauties of having a regular practice of meditation and centering prayer. And for me, it's always focused on that infinitely loving God force at the core of the universe as my co-creative, energizing source for helping to come to the highest and best good for all involved. It really is about, the one mind, and about all of us being in this together. We're here to help each other, take care of all fellow beings. This does not just include humans. because all living beings are part of this beautiful matrix of consciousness.
Beautifully stated. And, to recognize that we do embody prayer, and it's not just happening in those moments of conscious awareness of meditation. It's in those moments of mindfulness that we bring to all that we do. And as you were talking about the sacred acoustics, I'm remembering that, as you're experiencing the other realm in your NDE, you were talking about the music that you heard and the tones that you heard. And there is parallel, if you could just speak to that briefly, about the parallel between what you experienced in the NDE and the tones and the music you were hearing, and then what you experienced when you listened to sacred acoustics.
Well, to me, it's just fascinating the role sound has played in, the history of my life in recent decades. It all began with the fact that when I went into coma, I was head of scientific research for a group called Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation, which is all about sound, using sound to treat cancer, to treat in all kinds of different disorders. So I was fascinated by that. Then I go into coma and find that what we think of as music, vibration, frequency, certainly what we subjectively experience as music, is actually a way for our spirit to guide its journey into these realms. And for me, it was always all these transitions in the spiritual realm were accompanied by music. Now, of course, this is not music that you could ever hear with the ears, just like things in that realm. You can see far more than you could ever see with physical eyes. So our sensory apparatus is really, they're indicating to us various modes of knowing that can occur in that realm. But as I said, it's often knowledge through identification. You come to know things through becoming all of these relationships and things in the universe. And to me, sound was an incredibly important part of my journey, and learning to just use the memory of the music that I heard in these portal situations was a way to conjure up those portals again. Very important. And then look at kind of the fascinating role of sound in where I went after that. After my coma in the first 2 years, I read about 150 books on quantum physics, on consciousness, on the brain-mind connection, on spiritual journeys, East and West, et cetera, trying to make sense of it. But I came to realize that you can read all the books and go to the lectures and talk to people till the cows come home. If you don't explore your own consciousness, you're never going to come into any kind of knowing. Personal experience, as you pointed out, is absolutely essential. And that's when I realized I had to develop a regular practice of meditation. That's when I first found out about binaural beat brainwave entrainment. To me, it was very appealing because of what I said a few minutes ago about those sounds influencing the lower brainstem, which is where modern neuroscience would put kind of the ignition part of consciousness in that part of the brain. It doesn't mean consciousness is completely hosted in the brain. That's the important thing. The brain is just the filter, the transceiver that allows access to consciousness. But it is very important for bringing consciousness into a physical body, into a here, now, and sense of self. But ultimately, it is not so limited. And that's the important thing to get. But sound and the importance of sound in driving these journeys and navigating the spiritual realms, to me, it's just fascinating, that role of sound, especially once you realize that these kind of idealized sounds have nothing to do with vibrations of matter in space-time.
Yes, and it's about that vibrational frequency. As in my experience as a medium, it's about attuning to the particular vibrational frequency of that loved one in spirit. And it's like finding the right radio station. So you, hello, how are you? And then you're on it, and there's no static. You're there with them, having that communication because you're at that correct for them vibrational frequency. And so as you are working through your own understandings of meditation and of spiritual understanding, keeping in mind that vibrational frequency and how you're shifting into different gears can really accelerate your growth and your understanding of yourself as a soul.
Absolutely. And I think that principle of resonance is very important. And that has to do with recognizing our loved ones in the spiritual realm. And I would say it has to do very fully with a concept of resonance, with information that is kind of consistent, that has a constructive interference pattern. That's how I could come in and in my journey, my higher soul could arrange such that I would witness my birth sister as being my guardian angel. It's that resonance, that kind of sense of frequency in that realm. And it's a frequency concept that goes far beyond the notions of frequency in our four-dimensional space-time. But that is what I think allows us to have such connections. I love it how for example, Windbridge.org, in their research on mediumship, they have a quintuply blinded set of protocols that Julie Beischel developed. And all that the medium is given is a first name, like Ralph, okay? And you might wonder, how do they have a 76% success rate of mediumistic readings when all the medium gets is a first name? And one reason is that the sitter, that is the person who has lost the loved one, asks in a meditative or prayerful state, asks the soul of the departed loved one to connect the dots for the medium. In many ways, that is a function of resonance of information that is able to line up and connect the dots so that we are able to follow the pathway and get the answers we seek. That whole concept of resonance, I think, is very, very important because it starts to explain a lot about how we are able to traverse something as vast as the spiritual realm and yet come up with the factors that are important for us as individual souls. Every bit of that is due to resonance of information.
Yes, and the spiritual natural law of resonance and the law of vibrational frequency work along with that law of attraction that most people know of, so that communication can happen in those very viable and effective ways. And an experience such as you have had is something that, while unique to yourself, I think people feel the inspiration of the message that you're bringing, that strength and power of your experience that you've so eloquently described in your books and in your lectures. I think people will derive so much if they're able to come this summer, in fact, to Lilydale, that to be in the presence of you as you're speaking about these things, and as if you tell them and you relive them, you're entering into that vibrational frequency again. And so the rest of us are able to touch that as well.
That is absolutely true. And I mean, I must say, to me, giving talks on this all the time, especially when I talks in front of groups of near-death experiencers like the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS.org, people can learn more. But I sense this incredible resonance with the crowd. And in fact, often I'm sure the communication is going far beyond the words that are being spoken. I know that people have shared with me, people who both read the book Proof of Heaven and listened to the audiobook. They say they get so much more out of the audiobook. And it's because it's my voice. I'm telling the story. At the end of that recording the audiobook, there were places I broke down 6 or 7 times, emotionally, and had to re-record. And you can sense that, even though we finally got one where it wasn't too broken up, you can feel the emotion in my voice. And that kind of heartfelt sense of communication is something that we can share in many, many ways, the sharing of the story, but especially when it's shared kind of in person by voice in a personal telling. That's where we can really get that resonance with our fellow beings that I think can be so powerful. And one reason I'm especially interested in this Lilydale conference, Karen and I are both very excited about the mid-July conference there, because we'll be there with our dear and near and dear friend, Raymond Moody, who wrote the book Life After Life back in 1975. We presented with Raymond many a time. He's a beautiful, loving soul with a tremendous message of kind of hope and understanding. And not only that, but kind of a pinnacle, because this is the first time we've been with him, is with Christopher Kerr. He wrote that beautiful book, Death is But a Dream. It came out about 3 or 4 years ago. It's all about his hospice work in Hospice Buffalo, upstate New York. So all he deals with are people who are dying. He's not interested in near-death experiences. He's interested in people who die. And what you find out is what they go through in terms of loved ones, souls of departed loved ones coming to help them in the transition. Once you realize that's not a hallucination, but it's basically an imprimatur that shows you, okay, they're close to death. This is very real. That is the value. And the fact that all of his work is completely hospice oriented, and yet he finds exactly the same things unfolding that are described in the near-death literature. You start to realize it's all the same. The dying process is the same. And it involves a liberation of consciousness, not a constriction. And it's very loving. It's about a reunion with loved ones who've left the physical plane. And again, realizing that that is actually the imprimatur that tells you that it's an authentic spiritual experience related to the transition of death. That is where the real gift is. So we are so excited to be there with Christopher Kerr, to talk with him and to present with him. I can tell you, especially because Karen has been a giant fan of his ever since she read his book, and we can't wait to meet him and to present with him. So that'll be a ton of fun. And of course, getting together with Raymond and Cheryl is always a treat. So we're very excited about Lilydale. And I think, there's so much that's happened since the last time I was there in terms of my understanding. I think this will be a very valuable session for people who are interested in this kind of topic.
Beautiful. Oh, well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us. And if people want to know more about Dr. Eben Alexander, please visit his website that's posted there. And also come to Lilydale. Come to Lilydale on July 14th, 15th, and 16th, so you can be in the presence of this gentleman who's had this amazing, incredible experience and wants to share it with you in a deep, abiding way that you are part of the divine and so very loved. Well, thank you again for being here. I appreciate it so very much.
Willa, thank you so much for having me on. And I would just like to remind people who want to catch up on all this, if they were fans of Proof of Heaven, there's a 10th anniversary edition of that book that came out last October that has 36 additional pages that go into a lot of detail of what's happened since. And of course, that, in addition to Living in a Mindful Universe, will certainly get you well up to speed with what we'll be presenting in Lilydale in mid-July.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next week for another great show of Wednesdays with Willa. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.